We live in a more and more peaceful world. Since the end of the 2 world wars, states have increasingly solved their conflicts by talking, by trading, by inventing common rules. But diplomacy, the peaceful conversation between states, is under pressure from our leaders' need for public spotlight and the emergence of social media. What happens when our political leaders use their smartphones during negotiations? Let me take you backstage into the negotiation room in Ukraine during one of the most serious crises between Europe and Russia since the end of the Cold War. For several decades, European Union and Ukraine have sought to establish closer ties. But then, suddenly, in the fall of 2013, the Ukrainian government changes its mind and failed to sign the treaty, the association agreement with the EU. Protests explode in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, with up to 800,000 people marching in the street, waving the flags of the EU and Ukraine, demanding the president to step down and the agreement to be signed. Thousands of people are hospitalized and hundreds of people lose their lives in clashes between protesters and security forces. Back in Copenhagen, I'm in shock, and so are my former colleagues in the Danish Foreign Ministry and ministries across Europe. What we, or they, thought was a long, tiresome, sometimes very bureaucratic process of decades has turned into a major geopolitical crisis. In the negotiation room, we have the Ukrainian government, we have a Russian representative, and international mediators, the foreign minister from Poland, France, and Germany. And they've flown into Kiev the same morning, and they're trying to broker a deal that would end the violence. Negotiations continue throughout the night and throughout the day. 30 hours of negotiations, almost without break, and then early Friday morning, people are exhausted. The atmosphere is tense. Still no green light for any kind of agreement. And then all of a sudden, from inside the negotiation room, the Polish foreign minister, Sikorski, tweets, "We're about to sign. Good compromise for Europe. Gives peace a chance and opens a way to reform into Europe. Poland and EU support it." Whew. The tweet goes viral. The global media especially picks it up, and Sikorski is hailed as a hero, the grand savior of the European peace. And I'm excited to follow this in Copenhagen on my smartphone. But very soon, Sikorski is criticized for rushing with the tweet, taking credit for a very fragile peace agreement before it's even made official. In fact, his critics are saying that with this premature tweet, he's basically jeopardizing the entire peace process. But Sikorski is not the only one playing with his phone at negotiations. In fact, he's just one example of the entanglement between confidential negotiations on the one hand and this public display. As a scholar in political science with a background in the foreign ministry, I'm faced with one pressing issue. Diplomacy used to be about confidentiality, restraint, politeness, all keys to international mediation. But diplomacy has entered a new phase. Some call it the information age, others the digital age. And for Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, this new era represents a new time, a promise of a world where distance does not matter, where all the historical divisions that have separated the people in the world will no longer matter. In fact, distance does not matter. And what he called the information highway means that we will increase the understanding that citizens have of the neighboring countries and thus reduce international tensions. Wonderful. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. We have seen a digital revolution, but not the one that Gates dreamt of. Today, no longer only negotiating behind the closed doors, our leaders engage with the public through social media such as Twitter and Facebook, and this interferes directly with the negotiations. It happens simultaneously. But not long ago, our leaders were very reluctant to go on social media. Back in 2007, Barack Obama was the first world leader, or among the first, to create his own Twitter account, and only a handful of him followed that year of our heads of state and government. Didn't really dare to do so. So he became president, and since then, the use of social media by our heads of state and government has exploded. So today, 178 countries from 92% of all UN member states, representing an audience, or reaching out to an audience, of 356 million Twitter users. They have their own Twitter accounts, these leaders. And many of them, they tweet themselves, okay? No filter. So, social media has gone from being this weird afterthought to being the very first thing they think about when they wake up in the morning. Now, of course, the public was always important. But this embrace of online channels and this transparency has created a world of openness that we have never experienced before. But in the hands of our political leaders, a smartphone can become a lethal weapon. And I can clearly see how these open doors, they challenge diplomacy's three foundational pillars. The first pillar of diplomacy, that's time. Why time? Why does diplomacy require time? It requires time because you need that time to mature a process of negotiation. When I was working in the Danish Foreign Ministry, we were preparing the meetings between the 28 member states in the EU. And we would start weeks, and actually sometimes months before the summit, circulating ideas, having pre-meetings at very low levels, drafting ideas on everything from refugee policy to energy, anti-terrorism, to get those compromises just right. And then, I remember in the days before the summit, we would work long hours, really, really long hours, basically staying in the ministry throughout the night in order to get the words right for our prime minister. We were drafting the speech notes. And what kept us going through those very long days and nights, that wasn't caviar or champagne, but that was pizza, takeaway pizza, and coffee. Lots of coffee. And the knowledge that our colleagues in Bratislava, in Athens, and Berlin, they were doing exactly the same thing. And they were doing this because they sincerely knew and believed that we were contributing with peaceful solutions and compromises between our countries. So that's time. Crucial. But the second pillar of diplomacy is space. You need a confidential space to find out where the other party's red line really lies. Without that confidential or safe space, there's simply no room to maneuver, to have a mental wiggle room, or to improvise, or just brainstorm collectively. And that's why, when you had to end the civil war in Yugoslavia, it couldn't end in Yugoslavia. You basically had to fly, in 1995, the warring parties out of the country, all the way to Dayton, Ohio, put them in a room for 21 days, and that then resulted in that compromise, the Dayton Agreement, the peace agreement, away from press, away from domestic constituencies. So a confidential space. But the third pillar of diplomacy is tact, or what we in diplomatic language call protocol. It's all about saving the face of the other. It's about taking into consideration the emotions or feelings of the other person. And it's actually not that weird. If you think about entering a bus, and the bus is full, and you would really like a seat, but it's full. Then there's an elderly lady, you see her, she's sitting, and she's put her handbag next to her on the seat, the only free seat. Then you don't go, move your stuff, lady. You say, excuse me, is this seat taken? And she'll probably remove the bag. Now that's tact, right? If you move that to the international level, where the tensions are really, really high, where the cultural differences may be enormous, then you know why diplomats, they disagree, but they disagree without being disagreeable. Now, all these three pillars of diplomacy are fundamentally challenged by the 24/7 coverage of every single foreign policy event and social media. If you take time and space, leaders, they rush to be the first to tweet. And of course, mistakes and blunders happen. And this leads to a great risk of conflict escalation. Last year, the Pakistani defense minister reacted to a news article he'd read. And he'd read that actually Israel was threatening Pakistan with nuclear weapons. And so he felt the need to react, on Twitter, of course. And he said, hey, Israel, by the way, remember, Pakistan is a nuclear power too. Okay, just think about it, just for 1 second. This is one nuclear power threatening almost explicitly another nuclear power with war on Twitter. Now, if the Pakistani defense minister had only double-checked this article, he might have realized, as the Israeli defense ministry had to explain, that actually the whole story, the statement attributed to the former Israeli defense minister, was never said. In fact, the whole story was entirely false. Fake story. Okay, patience is gone. But so is confidentiality, and tact is gone too, because you can only be so diplomatic in 140 characters. So, are we just doomed to watch these Twitter wars run out of control and the world becoming a more dangerous place? How can we use social media constructively in international relations? Well, a first option that I think many of my colleagues would sometimes really want is basically to take away those smartphones from our leaders. Just leave them outside the door when they negotiate. Shut down the Twitter accounts at the conflict moments. The problem with that option is it really takes us away from all the positive aspects of the digital revolution. After all, it is that revolution that has enabled us to follow events far away, to reach out between nations. And also, if we took away those smartphones and those digital devices, they would just invent other ways of reaching us, other ways of inventing a platform. So that's not really an option. Okay, another possibility that I thought long about was, why don't we create a kind of a rule book, a do's and don'ts for diplomats on social media, a kind of guideline. This is what you should do and not do. The problem with that option is that either our leaders wouldn't follow these rules because they're not binding, or if they did, nobody would put any attention to these tweets because they would be way too polished and frankly, way too boring. So, the problem with these solutions, these answers, is that they don't really touch the core of the problem. The core of the problem is that we simply only scratch the surface. We only scratch the surface when we talk about these issues. The problem is we credit those that are loud and visible, and we neglect those discreet negotiators. Most fundamentally, and we help them doing that, social media turns our leaders' attention away from the tedious work of brokering deals to managing their public face. And worse, by doing that, they're basically taking themselves away from what they're claiming to do, namely solving international conflicts. So, my idea is that we should be able to look under the surface, to see the rest of the iceberg. So far, what we see is basically the tips of the iceberg, but often not really the right one. We pay attention to all these Facebook updates everywhere. So how are we going to do that? We first have to admit that the Paris Climate Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, that required years and months and days and very long hours to actually achieve. And so digital revolution has helped us follow these events, but we will only harvest the fruits of the digital revolution if we're able to look behind the scenes, to look at the people, the women and men who work night and day to carve out compromises. And we, the public, urgently need to understand what their work means, not just for your individual interest, but for our collective ability to create and maintain peace. Unless we go under the surface, we simply will not be able to elect the right people to handle world politics. And I don't think I have to mention any names here. So, we need citizens that participate actively in foreign policy events, engage critically with social media. And I'm not saying that we should get all the details on every single confidential material on the negotiation table, but we do need to understand what lies between the updates, the Instagram, and the Facebook. And I ask you, when you leave this room, please remember the 3 pillars of diplomacy. Please remember that time, space, and tact has so far been crucial to arrive at any kind of peace deal. So if we have active citizens participating actively, we also need these citizens to demand and to get the bigger picture of what it actually takes to get us into that negotiation room. As you do, right this moment. Thank you.